Welcome to Top Stock Picks. I am your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm here with you to launch this new weekly podcast as an adjunct to my weekly radio show, Turning Hard Times into Good Times. It's aired live every week on the Voice America Business Channel at 3 p.m. New York time. Well, believing that we are in the early stages of a major bull market in precious metals and commodities in general, but not finding sufficient time in my one-hour show every week at Voice America to expand the coverage of the many interesting stories that I'd like to share with you, I've chosen to begin providing additional coverage here on the Top Stock Picks podcast that airs every week after the Voice America show. So you can listen to it at 4 o'clock at jtaylormedia.com every Tuesday. And also, I talk a lot to the newsletter writers, independent newsletter writers at the Metals Investor Forum, and the ideas that they have. They share those with you. But I also have some of my own ideas that I talk about in my own newsletter. And so one of those is I'm going to talk to you today about. We're going to have Brian Ostroff. He's the CEO of Arianne Phosphate. He's going to be with us in just a moment. Generally speaking, I will be interviewing, as I say, independent newsletter writers that appear at the forum, and I'd like to remind you that the next Metals Investor Forum is coming up on May 5th and May 6th in Vancouver at the Georgia Hotel. This is the best resource-oriented conference that I've ever been a part of, and so if you're able to attend that in Vancouver, I would urge you, though, not to delay. You need to sign up and pre-register. It is free, but you have to sign up because space is limited, and I understand the chairs are filling up very rapidly. So go to jtaylormedia.com, J-A-Y, taylormedia.com. Just go to the Metals Investor Forum banner, click on there, put your email address in there and your name, and you'll be assured a free entry to the Metals Investor Forum on May 5th and May 6th. Well, let's turn now to my guest today, Brian Ostroff. He's the CEO of Arianne Phosphate Company. Arianne Phosphate Inc. actually is the exact legal name. That's a company that I believe is grossly undervalued and one that I believe may actually soon be discovered by the market. So welcome, Brian. I'm glad that you could join me today.
Well, I appreciate you having me on, Jay. Thank you.
Really good to talk to you. I should tell my listeners that Arianne trades in Toronto under the symbol DAN. You can buy it in the United States on the over-the-counter market, as I have, under the symbol DRRSF. 97.6 million shares, trading around 95 cents Canadian, 71 cents U.S., giving it a market capitalization of around 69 million in U.S. money. Well, Brian, this is really an interesting story and one that I have been following, as you know, for a number of years. It hasn't seemed yet to really be appreciated by the market. If you look at the fundamentals, and that's what I want to talk to you about, the fundamentals for the industry and your project in particular, maybe we could start out by asking you to explain the role of phosphate as a fertilizer crop. What does it do in terms of enhancing the yields for farmers?
Phosphate is one of the three major nutrients that are required in fertilizer. Potash and nitrogen are the other two. And, I think it's important that your listeners understand that although all these three things are used in fertilizer, they really aren't the same. They each serve different functions, but even with regards to the market as a whole, they have their own supply-demand. They really are independent of one another, other than they just all wind up back in fertilizer. And so, first and foremost is that I know this is a slightly more investor-oriented media forum. I think that it's important that investors understand that the three components are different, and potash is the one that gets a lot of attention, but nitrogen, phosphate, they have their own dynamics, and we can get into that a little later. But basically, you do need all. Phosphate is vital for plant growth. It helps in the photosynthesis, the genetic transfer, which really allows the genetic code of a crop to move from one generation to the next. And so it's basically the blueprint for all the aspects of plant growth and development. The bottom line is, if you don't have phosphate, you don't have yield, and therefore you're not going to have your crops and animal feed and what have you. So it's a very, very necessary component if we're going to sustain these 7 billion people that live on this planet.
Right. Would you say, Brian, in terms of the supply and demand for phosphate, demand is pretty constant, or does it vary, with the agricultural industry in general?
Right. So actually, the demand for phosphate really does kind of grow every year. Right now, it's running year-over-year growth at about 2% for phosphate rock, which means we need an additional 4 million or so tons every year to be added. And so that's really a product, of course, of population growth, but also changes in diet. Third world countries, as more and more emerge into the middle class, they want more protein, and it's the joke I always say, which is, a chicken is really just corn with feathers on it. And so as people want more and more protein, you need to feed the chickens and the pigs and the cows, and that requires a tremendous amount of grains and animal feed. And so, that too is also driving the demand for fertilizers to enhance the yields of the crops.
All right, so that's the demand side, briefly commented on. What about the supply side? Now, one of the aspects that I appreciate about your project, called the Lac Paul project in Quebec, is that you have an environmentally friendly project compared to other phosphate projects. So, Brian, can you talk just in general about the current supply of phosphate and the sources and what are some of the problems of some of those sources?
So I think that's a very important point. I had said earlier that all three of the major nutrients have their own supply-demand, and what's really interesting for phosphate is most of the world runs a deficit of phosphate. So, North America has to import, as does South America and Western Europe and most of Asia. And that whole deficit is made up mostly from the Middle East and North Africa. And so Morocco today is by far the largest player in phosphate. Interesting note for your listeners, Morocco is close to 4 times bigger in the phosphate market, export market, than Saudi Arabia is in the oil market. And so Tunisia used to be the second largest. Arab Spring has knocked out most of their production, about 80%. Syria used to be a producer. Today, Jordan is the second largest producer. So, I think that it's important that we understand that our food chain, if you will, is really tied to the stability of that area of the world. So, that is, when you look at North America centric, we import about 4 million tons, and that's projected to continue to grow as some of the mines down in Florida deplete. Now, the other thing that you had touched on, which I think is also important, is the environmental aspect. So, phosphate, a lot of people see as it's bad stuff. It's not environmentally friendly, and that's not accurate. A lot of people see phosphate. It contributes to the growth of things, and so when it does wind up in the streams, it does cause algae to grow a little bit more, a little quicker, but that's not the issue of the phosphate itself. As I had said earlier, the wonderful thing about phosphate is it helps things grow. Now, what is a little troubling about most of the world's phosphate is about 90% of the world's phosphate comes from something called a sedimentary deposit. So all of that stuff in the Middle East and North Africa, the stuff here in Florida, it comes from this type of deposit, and in those deposits, there are other nasty elements that kind of been mixed in. So you've got things like uranium and thorium, which are radioactive, and heavy metals like cadmium. and it is a big deal. The world is starting to wake up to that. There have been a couple of environmental issues down in Florida, which have resulted in some large fines having to be paid. And in Europe, there is legislation that's being put in place to reduce the amount of cadmium in the phosphate that comes in. So, the offshoot of all of this is there is this rare type of deposit called igneous, which is what Arianne has. There's about 12 igneous deposits in the world. It only represents about 10% of the world's production, but it's clean. It does not have the radioactive elements and doesn't have the heavy metals, and so it makes it pretty special. And Arianne's fortunate to have one of these types of deposits.
Right, and it's a very large deposit. It's known as the Lac Paul project. Talk to us a little bit about the size of this project and perhaps get into the economics of it. I know that you had a feasibility study done in 2013. You've made some updates and probably have cut some costs from that feasibility study. But can you give us an idea of the size and impact that this project might have in this sector, in the phosphate markets?
Great, and so that's a good point. The company did put out its feasibility right at the end of 2013. It was very well received. One of the things that it really did, aside from alerting investors, is it took the Lac Paul project and it put it on the map in terms of a lot of the fertilizer players now got to know of the project. And so at the time of the feasibility, it was projected to have a 26-year life of mine, 3 million tons a year of phosphate concentrate, grading 39%, again, going back to this very high purity type of concentrate, $1.2 billion CapEx, and that would have us an operation that would have that phosphate rock loaded on a ship at $94 a ton, and gave us an NPV of around $1.9 billion. Now, since then, over the last 2-3 years, the company's made a lot of progress and has been able to wring out a lot of costs. So first and foremost, they were able to drill off more of a resource. Today, I'm happy to say that Arianne is sitting on the world's single largest greenfield phosphate rock deposit, including inferred. It is well over 1 billion tons. And so one of the things that we wanted to demonstrate was that, almost think bigger, think beyond the 26 years. We've been able to streamline our process of making the concentrate by being able to remove some reagents, and we cut a good deal with Hydro-Quebec. And so all in, we've actually been able to reduce our costs considerably. What was projected at $94 a ton on a ship today sits at about $79 a ton on a ship. And so we're continuing to tweak that. And, I guess beyond that, what has happened since the feasibility, a couple of major things. We have signed our collaboration agreement with the First Nations. And a little over a year ago, we received our final permits, and so we have a fully permitted mine.
Oh, so but we're talking about a project that could conceivably be worth 1.2 billion or more or less, based on I think that. Oh, I'm sorry, 1.9 was the NPV figure. I think you said, right?
Yeah, so back in 2013, that was the NPV, and so we were trading it at just a small fraction.
A small fraction of it. Now,
yes.
you mentioned with a 26-year mine life, you might be looking to go beyond that. Now, Brian, as an investor, I know the present value, once you get beyond 26 years, doesn't add very much. Is it possible that you might be able to increase the production on an annual basis and push that production forward and enhance the NPV? Is that something that might be in the cards?
Certainly that is something that could be done. Right now, we're targeting 3 million tons, really because if you look, for example, in North America, we as I had mentioned, run a deficit of about 4 million tons a year. And one of the things also that we're very fortunate about where our project is situated in that most of our required infrastructure is already in place. And that includes a power dam that's 30 kilometers away. That includes a large haul road that's in place that goes right down to the river. And that infrastructure today is certainly capable of a 3 million ton operation. We definitely have the resource that if we want to expand our annual output, we could. But with it would come a required upgrade to the present infrastructure.
Okay.
So, we'd have to, I guess, take a look and do the math around that if we want to increase and square that off against what it might mean to our CapEx. But if there is demand, if there are, say, potential partners out there that have bigger balance sheets than ours and bigger demands than ours, it's certainly something that could be done.
Well, we talked about the market cap of your company, $69 million in U.S. money right now, compared to a huge CapEx that you talked about based on your feasibility study. You're going to need some partners, I would imagine. You just mentioned partners. Who are some of the major players that might find this project a must-have project? Who are some of the major players in the fertilizer industry? One place or another in the fertilizer industry that might find this project attractive, and who might come into this equation?
Right. Well, that's an interesting question. The industry itself, the phosphate industry, is a very vertically integrated business. As it turns out, about 85% of the world's phosphate mines are actually owned by the guys who make the fertilizer or the end product. And I say end product because there is a growing amount now that makes its way into food as well. Anyone who drinks Coke or Diet Coke or has any type of deli or anything with preservatives, they are ingesting phosphate. So most of the world's mines are owned by the guys who make the end product, and that's not by accident. That's the economics dictate. Once someone does not have enough of their own phosphate rock to turn into their end product, and they have to go out and they buy it from a third party like Morocco or Jordan or what have you. And by the time you bought it from a third party, shipped it, turned it into fertilizer, and then sell the fertilizer, there's almost no margin. And so, who would be interested in a project like this? It would really be the fertilizer guys who right now are not fully vertically integrated. So, when you look at just even North America, Agrium currently imports phosphate rock, as does Potash Corp and Mosaic. So that doesn't even touch on a lot of the other kind of large global fertilizer players that have to import phosphate. India is the world's largest importer of phosphate. So, I think that certainly if you look at the economics and you have some level of concern about the security of supply, given where this comes from, I think that there's going to continue to be a growing interest in our project and what it might mean to some of these larger guys.
Let's say, Brian. I mean, it seems to me that you are really dependent, to a certain extent, at least, on somebody, on some major coming in and saying, "We got to have this project." Or maybe I'm not. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Or do you think you might be able to take this thing forward further? I mean, you've done so much with it already. You've got a bankable feasibility study 2013. You've upgraded and reduced costs since then. Are there people out there that are really watching your project? You may not be able to name them, but are there some out there that are really paying some attention now? And what happens if you don't find a big partner to come in and help you finance this 1.2 billion capex that's required?
So I'm going to tackle that on a few fronts. So first and foremost, I'm very comfortable in saying that I think most of the large fertilizer players are very well of our project. Again, it is the world's largest green field. It makes one of the, if not the purest concentrates on the planet. It is well situated, and so we know a lot of these players, and these players know who we are. That having been said, I don't believe that it's a great strategy to just count on being taken out, nor does the economics necessarily mean that we should just take the first bid that comes along. And so what the company is doing today, we are actively pursuing this as an independent. If someone comes along and wants to either partner with us or decide that they want the entire asset for themselves, we'll have that discussion. But we are going forward until basically someone pays us to stop. And so to your point, yes, 1.2 billion is a large capex, and I think that on the surface that number I think can look scary, but the reality is most people don't look at the other side of the equation, which is you have a project here that should really do gross revenues at today's phosphate prices, which have come down over the last few years, but at today's prices should probably do somewhere around $550 million in gross revenue, should do gross profit of around $300 million. And so, you're really only looking at a 4-year payback for a project that, I don't know how long it's going to be producing, but it's certainly going to be producing beyond my lifetime and probably that of another generation or two. And so I think banks recognize that. At the end of the day, a lot of the financing is going to come by way of project finance bank, export credit agencies. Certainly the equipment manufacturers tend to come with financing as well. And banks don't look at a company's market cap and decide whether the project makes sense to finance or not.
Right.
The banks look at the economics of the project, and they're quite robust. And so we've been making some very strong progress in terms of our financing. A couple of our recent deals with ABB and FL Smith come with commitments to help assist us in looking at financing strategies, and introductions have been made into their respective export credit agencies. So it is a tall task, but I think that it's one that we've been able to demonstrate that we're making good progress on.
Brian, with respect to that, it seems to me that maybe people are just looking at that market cap and not looking at the other side of the equation. But why do you think this project is so good? It looks so good on paper. Why do you think the market is largely ignoring it in terms of the share price?
I'll tell you, that's a question I ask myself and have been asking myself for a few years now. And I think that it is really kind of come down to maybe a combination of three things. The feasibility came out in late 2013. The fertilizer market pretty much topped around the beginning of 2013.
Mm-hmm.
And so all this progress that the company has been able to make and show how great the project has really been done, unfortunately, against the backdrop of people just haven't liked fertilizer, haven't wanted to be a part of it, and so, it really didn't matter what we did at that time. No one really cared. So that's the people who knew fertilizer.
Mm-hmm.
Beyond that, I think Arianne was not a particularly well-known story, and so you just never got that much attention. And then, of course, lastly, for those who did look, I think that question of small company, big capex, how are they going to address it? Now, what I do think is that all of these matters have gotten better. So fertilizer prices have started to get better. There have actually been a whole bunch of transactions in this space. You've had, over the last 12 months, about $250 billion worth of deals in the ag space, which maybe 45 billion has been in the FERT space.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the sector's looking up. Fertilizer prices have started to come off bottom. Grain prices have definitely come off bottom. Even some of the larger name FERT stocks have come off bottom, actually with many of them having hit 52-week highs about 6-7 weeks ago. Mm-hmm. So that's gotten better. I think that we've progressed to a point that if anyone's looking at this space, they will come to know of Arianne, and so we won't be as obscure. And again, I think a couple of our recent announcements show that we've been making pretty good progress towards getting the financing in place as well. So, I would think, certainly I would hope, that Arianne market cap should start to, move up and be a little bit more representative of the asset that it is in control of.
Certainly seems like it should be, Brian. What sort of drivers then, let's just say over the next few months, what should investors be looking for that I guess maybe you hit on some of those, the progress you're making, but clearly the stock has started to move a little bit in the last few days, I think. But what drivers should people keep their eye on now?
Well, again, I think it's a matter of looking for continued progress out of the company, continued partnering with various organizations. Over the last 8-9 weeks, we've announced deals with ABB and Proco and FL Smith and SNC and Hydro-Quebec and even Rio Tinto. Mm-hmm. And, I think that the big takeaway from these announcements is, it's not just little old Arianne anymore. It's not this small sub-$100 million market cap company chasing down this project. We now are, in touch with and working with these big players, and, quite honestly, I don't think these big players would be wasting much time with us if they didn't think that the project was going to be a reality. And so I think that there are more milestones coming up. Continue to close in on securing the last of the financing required, and of course, this is a pretty interesting asset, and one never knows what might happen on the partnership front with some other larger fertilizer players.
No, I think one of these days people are going to wake up and say, Arianne, where did that come from? I've been following it for a number of years, as you know, Brian, thanks to you, and it's a story that it just seems like it's one I have to own. I have to own some shares of this thing because one of these days I think people are going to wake up to it. Anything else you'd like to add today before we conclude our discussion?
Well, I just echo your sentiments. This is a one-of-a-kind asset, and I know a lot of your listeners, they do watch probably a lot more so the metals, the gold, silver, and I'm just going to throw out this reminder of 15 months ago. Everyone hated everything, and then all of a sudden the metals started to move. And of the juniors, which are the companies that moved first? It was the guys who had the real project that, even though despite bad times, continued to advance those projects.
Right.
And then the turn came. And so that was 15 months ago, and a lot of these names have done extremely well. Well, I think that the bottom came in kind of in the fertilizer space about 6 months ago.
Mm-hmm.
But the real difference, there are 1,000 junior metals names out there.
That's true.
There just aren't that many in the junior ag space, and I think you'd be hard-pressed to come up with a half dozen names in the phosphate space. So I believe the turn has come. We've seen a whole lot of big corporate deals. Maybe the market hasn't quite figured it out yet, but it will. And I just think that this thing is going to be too big, too prominent to ignore. And really, at the end of the day, you can't eat gold and you can't drink oil. You need phosphate. And there's just not that many world-class deposits out there to be had when the time does come, and I think it's coming.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Brian, for that. And we'll keep our eyes on the company. Arianne Phosphate, again, trades in Toronto under the symbol DAN, and you can buy it in the U.S. under the symbol DRRSF. $69 million US dollar market cap, I think with a ton of upside potential. Likely to happen. If this project is real, and I believe it is, it's going to happen. So thanks again, Brian, for being with us. Well, folks, before closing today's show, I do want to remind you once again, space is limited at the Metals Investor Forum, Hotel Georgia, downtown Vancouver, May 5th and May 6th, so don't delay. Go to J. Taylor Media right away if you intend to go to that show, because space is filling up. jtaylormedia.com. Click on the Metals Investor Forum banner. Name and email address will get you in free of charge. Next week on Tuesday, Peter Grandich, Michael Oliver, and Ralph Fitch are my guests on the radio show, and John Kaiser will be with me on Top Stock Picks. Until then, blessings, peace, and happiness to you all.